Apple has a problem with the iPhone Ultra. It's not first, not even close. Samsung launched its first foldable smartphone in 2019. Apple is entering in 2026. That's a full 7-year gap, 7 years. So let me ask you, after waiting that long, would you accept the same visible crease? The same chunky body? The same hinge worries? I wouldn't, and apparently, Apple knows that. According to the latest reports, Apple's foldable iPhone Ultra is expected around the newly confirmed September 9 Apple event. And there are 3 areas where Apple seems to have spent that 7-year wait. I'm not going to give you all 3 immediately, but one involves a display problem foldables have had since the beginning. Another is about making this thing thin without destroying performance. And the last one, Apple has been sitting on that technology for more than 15 years. That's the one I really want to talk about. But first, open any foldable. Where do your eyes go? Straight to the middle, right? The crease could finally become something you stop seeing. This is probably Apple's biggest visual challenge. A foldable display has to bend, and once a flexible OLED bends thousands of times around the same line, you normally get some kind of crease. Samsung has had 7 years to improve this since 2019, and modern foldables are much better. But can you still see a crease under the right light? Yes, that's why Apple coming in this late changes expectations. Apple reportedly isn't targeting a smaller crease. The target is a virtually crease-free display. Important word, virtually, not physically impossible to see. Reports suggest that under certain angles with specific lighting you may still catch a very faint line, but during normal use, the expectation is that the inner screen should largely look flat. Now ask yourself, would that actually matter to you? I think it would, because you don't just see the crease on some foldables, you can feel that center area while swiping too. If Apple can make both the visual dip and the physical feeling much less obvious, the screen starts feeling less like 2 halves, more like 1 tablet. And that matters because Apple didn't arrive in 2019, it arrived 7 years later. If the crease looks exactly the same as every other foldable, what did those 7 years buy us? Exactly, this is where the weight needs to show. But here's the harder problem. You can make the display beautiful, then ruin the phone when you close it, because foldables have 2 halves. 2 halves stacked together means thickness. So what happens if Apple simply makes each side extremely thin? Battery suffers, cooling suffers, performance can suffer. That brings us to the second part. Apple wants thin without making you pay for it in performance, and this is where the iPhone Air becomes much more interesting. Last year's iPhone Air may have looked like Apple experimenting with thinness, but reports suggest it was also a stepping stone toward the foldable. Think about what Apple had to learn there. How do you fit a powerful iPhone into less internal space? How do you arrange the battery? Where does the logic board go? How do you move heat away from the chip? How do you keep the phone rigid? Those lessons matter much more when you're building a foldable, because now you have another huge mechanical part in the middle. The Hinge in Apple doesn't have unlimited space, so here's the important part. The iPhone Ultra is not expected to beat the iPhone 18 Pro Max in battery life. That makes sense. Would you honestly expect a thin folding phone to outlast the biggest battery-focused Pro Max? Probably not. The real target is different. Can Apple make battery life good enough that you don't feel like you're sacrificing something every time you open the big display? That's what matters, and Apple has 2 important chips helping a 20 Pro and C2. Why do those matter? Efficiency. Take a 20 Pro first. A foldable has less room to deal with heat, so even if Apple could make the CPU 20% faster, what happens if the phone gets hot after 10 minutes? That extra performance becomes much less useful. You start gaming. Chip heats up, screen is bright, 5G is running, battery is draining, then the system may have to reduce performance. So on iPhone Ultra, efficiency can matter more than peak benchmark numbers. Would you rather have the highest score for 5 minutes or stable performance for 30 or 40 minutes? I take stable performance every time. And then C2, the modem matters for the same reason. Your cellular modem is working all day, strong signal, easy weak signal. It has to work harder, more power, more heat, more battery use. So if C2 improves efficiency, that matters even more in a thin foldable where Apple has less thermal room to waste. But chips alone don't solve heat. That's why another reported feature matters: vapor chamber cooling. Now this sounds very geeky, but the benefit is simple. Instead of heat building up around one small area near the chip, a vapor chamber spreads that heat across a larger surface. Why do you care? Gaming, long camera sessions, navigation, 5G video editing, anything that keeps the chip working hard. You don't want one hot spot. You want the heat spread out. So imagine this. You play a game for 40 minutes. Would you rather the phone be ridiculously fast for the first 10, then slow down, or stay much more consistent through the whole session? That's what proper thermal design is trying to solve. And this is why ultra-thin by itself isn't impressive. Anyone can make a device thin by removing things. The impressive part is making it thin while still giving you good battery and sustained performance. That's much harder. But honestly, the third upgrade may be the most Apple-like part of this whole phone, because this story starts more than 15 years ago. The Hinge could use technology Apple has had since around 2010. The iPhone Ultra Hinge is rumored to use liquid metal, And Apple's history with this material goes way back more than 15 years. Apple licensed liquid metal technology around 2010. Think about that, the iPhone 4 era, more than a decade before Apple was expected to sell a folding iPhone. And even back then, there was discussion about liquid metal being useful for making devices thinner, lighter, and potentially useful in folding hardware. Now in 2026, that material may finally have the perfect job, the hinge. Why is that such a big deal? Because the hinge is doing far more than opening and closing the phone. It controls how the display bends, it affects the crease, it affects how flat the phone opens, it affects thickness, and it affects how the phone feels after years of use. Think about your expectations day one. Hinge feels perfect, smooth, solid, great, but what about year two? Would you accept it becoming loose? Would you accept one side moving differently? Would you accept the screen no longer opening completely flat? Not on a phone likely sitting at the very top of Apple's lineup. That's why material choice matters. A hinge sees repeated stress again and again and again. You might open your phone 50 times a day, maybe 100 at 100 openings per day. That's about 36,500 hinge movements in 1 year over 3 years. Around 109,505 years. Around 182,500, and that's just simple everyday math. So suddenly durable hinge doesn't sound like a small feature, does it? That hinge could move well over 100,000 times during normal ownership, and it still needs to feel smooth. That's exactly where a material Apple has spent more than 15 years exploring could matter. Now connect this back to the crease. If the hinge controls the screen's bend more precisely, that may also help reduce stress through the center of the display. So the hinge and crease are not really two separate stories, they work together. Better hinge geometry, better control over the bend, potentially flatter looking display, that's the system, and this is where I think Apple's 7-year delay starts making more sense. Could Apple have released a foldable earlier? Almost certainly. Samsung proved the basic concept back in 2019. The technology existed. But ask a different question, could Apple have released one earlier with a virtually crease-free display and ultra-thin body, good battery, high-end performance, vapor chamber cooling, and a hinge built around this level of material engineering? That's much harder. And Apple has created a huge problem for itself by waiting, because now nobody is going to give them the first generation excuse, would you? Imagine Apple gets on stage September 9 and says, this is our first folding iPhone. Cool, then you open it, and there's a giant crease. No, people will immediately say you had 7 years. The hinge feels loose. Same reaction. You had 7 years. Battery dies early. Again, 7 years, that's the downside of waiting. You get more time, but people expect you to use it, and that's why these 3 areas matter so much, not because they're flashy, because they address the exact compromises that have followed foldable phones for years. Look at the numbers again. Samsung enters in 2019. Apple enters in 2026. 7 years later, Apple's liquid metal work goes back more than 15 years. Around 2010, a hinge opened 100 times per day, could see roughly 36,500 movements every year. 3 years, over 100,000, and Apple is trying to package all of this with a 20 Pro performance, C2 efficiency, and vapor chamber cooling in an ultra-thin body. That's the interesting part, not that it folds. Folding phones have existed for years. The question is whether Apple finally removes enough of the annoying parts that you stop thinking about the fact that it folds. You open it, no obvious crease, you close it. It doesn't feel like a brick. You game, performance stays stable. You use it all day, battery is good enough. You open and close it thousands of times, hinge still feels solid. If Apple gets those things right, then maybe 7 years late doesn't matter. But let me ask you, would a virtually invisible crease be enough to make you switch? Or do you need Pro Max level battery too? Because that may be the real trade-off. Apple doesn't need to prove it can make a folding phone. Samsung already proved that category works 7 years ago. Apple needs to prove something harder, that waiting until 2026 made the foldable better enough to justify arriving this late. And September 9 should finally tell us whether that 7-year wait bought Apple refinement or just time. Just remember, the September 9 Apple event is confirmed in the information you shared, but the iPhone Ultra hardware details remain based on reports and leaks. The virtually crease-free display, a 20 Pro/C2 efficiency, vapor chamber, and liquid metal hinge have not all been officially confirmed by Apple. Until Apple shows the final device and specifications, treat those hardware details as unconfirmed.